as South Africa, we are not anyone's enemy. I always tell my foreign minister colleagues, we don't seek to make enemies of anyone. What we seek to create are opportunities for our country, our people, and for the continent. And where we see wrong, we will take a moral stand. So on the question of Palestine, we are clear. It is immoral what is happening to the Palestinian people. We will also take a stand on what is happening in Sudan, on what is happening in the Sahel, and several other African countries. South Africa must play a role equitably everywhere to ensure peace and development and to utilize our achievement of democracy to support the achievement of democracy and development in all parts of the world. You know that today we are seeing the bombardment of innocent Palestinian civilians who played no role in the Hamas attack of October 7th. Those innocent civilians have no protection whatsoever. It should be the responsible of the United Nations to ensure peace enforcement and protection of civilians. What the current calamity illustrates is that we don't have proper security architecture, which can, through leadership of AU or SADC or the United Nations, offer protection to ordinary civilians who have no role in a conflict and played no contribution in initiating it. So we believe that there needs to be very firm attention to the matter of security architecture within our region, at the continental level, and globally through the United Nations. One of the things that we need to do is that we must address the ending of the dependence of Africa. Africa is an extremely rich continent with a majority of poor people. Largely, the reason is we do not control our own resources. I often tell journalists who interview me on this question of Palestine that, one of the intriguing realities of our history of struggle is that all African members of the Organization of African Unity stood with the anti-apartheid cause. And the Palestinian people are unfortunate because they are not getting a similar support from their region, but with us, Africa stood with us, and thus we must always stand with Africa.
What's up, guys? Once again, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm your host Larry, and in today's video I want us to listen to this video. It's a speech from let me use an impressive speech from Naledi Pandor from South Africa. I'm your host Larry, and Africa really needs people like Naledi Pandor, Dr. Arikana, like the likes of Ibrahim Traore, and most importantly Mia Amor Motley from the Caribbean. Africa really needs to unite. Africa is titled a continent that's rich in resources but also has poor people. So watch this video and then I'll be back with more comments.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad you have risen. For the one and only, the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa, Dr. Naledi Pandor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Program Director. I must confess that it is very nice to have young people clapping for me. It's most unusual. Normally, they're saying things like, why are you still here? You should retire. or go and look after your grandchildren and stuff like that. And I usually say to them, my grandchildren have parents who must look after them. It's not my job to look after grandchildren. And then they say, but when are you going to leave Parliament? You should go. We're tired of you. And I say, just to irritate you, I'll be here till I'm 90. All right, so it's lovely to get this welcome from you all. Allow me to begin. I was asked to talk about partnerships, international partnerships for advancing democracy and development. I want to begin by saying one of the most important changes that occurred on the African continent was the embrace of democracy and the commitment to implement and search for practices of good governance. One of the things we must never allow to happen is disrespect for the right of our people to choose who should govern them. This is a very important aspect of democracy, and it must be non-negotiable. But we also have to begin to get public representatives and governments that understand that their role is to respect the people's right to choose their own leaders as well as their own destiny. Too many countries on our continent have a democratic deficit. Indeed, it's true that there have been changes, there have been advances, but there's inadequate democracy, and we need to do more to build it throughout the continent of Africa. We also must ensure that we empower young people to be able to drive this change for the good for our continent. You will recall that our former president, President Thabo Mbeki, framed the notion of the rising of Africa by coining the concept, the African Renaissance, and by placing it firmly at the center of South Africa's foreign policy. So for South Africa, Africa is at the heart of our foreign policy. And you would recall President Mbeki further articulated this significance through his speech at the adoption of our Constitution on the 10th of May 1996, when he said, "I am an African," and set out through that speech the framework of an African agenda for South Africa. Following that important and epoch-marking speech, South Africa became actively involved in the transformation of the Organization of African Unity into the African Union, and our President Mbeki served as the first chair of the newly established African Union. Now, it's always important to recognize the significance of the Organization of African Unity to South Africa, and hence the significance of having Africa as our priority focus in our foreign policy. I often tell journalists who interview me on this question of Palestine that, one of the intriguing realities of our history of struggle is that all African members of the Organization of African Unity stood with the anti-apartheid cause. And the Palestinian people are unfortunate because they are not getting a similar support from their region, but with us, Africa stood with us. And thus we must always stand with Africa. One of the areas we've got to address on our continent, if we are to achieve the level of progress that is necessary for true development, we've got to combat unconstitutional changes of government on the continent. We must tell the military that they haven't been given the wisdom of knowing how you govern democratically. They should remain in the barracks, and they must allow the people democratically to choose the governments of their choice. We know, of course, that the African Union has tried to play an important role in sanctioning countries that don't respect democracy. But there has been criticism of the African Union in that it has not appeared to take any action against leaders on the continent who believe they are traditional leaders and can rule forever. We need to have an African Union that also speaks out against such practices. We have, as the African Union, the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance. It calls on member states to identify illegal means of accessing power or staying in office, including identifying refusal to relinquish office after free, fair, and transparent elections, and constitutional changes that infringe upon the principles of democratic change of power, and that we, as the African Union, should sanction those responsible. We have failed on this part, and it is diminishing our enjoyment of full democratic practice. So it's an aspect we need to attend to more assiduously. Now, as South Africa, one of the things we've tried to do in our international relations is to promote democracy, but also to advance sustainable development as a platform for our international engagements on the continent and globally. We believe to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we need to strengthen partnerships with developed and emerging economies to stimulate economic growth, trade, and investment. We have strong partnerships with the North countries, the more developed, richer countries, as well as with the United Nations in the area of peace and security, which is so important for our continent. And we have, as South Africa, made a major contribution to conflict resolution and peacemaking as part of our international diplomatic efforts. As South Africa, we believe as a country and government that without peace, you cannot have development, and without development, you will not have peace. Africa and its peaceful progress are at the heart of our policy and will remain so. We intend, as South Africa, to play a more proactive role in enhancing our peacemaking role and to build partnerships with others on the continent for stability and sustainable peace. Our country, when it returned to the international community, claimed its rightful space among the community of nations and emerged as a beacon of hope to many, having achieved a successful and peaceful transition from an oppressive apartheid state to a democracy today. We became actively involved in a range of mediation and negotiation efforts, playing a pivotal role in a number of peace processes. Just 2 weeks ago, I was part of President Ramaphosa's delegation to South Sudan. And you know, when you have these diplomatic meetings, poor ministers can't say anything. We just watch our presidents, and if we think they're putting a foot wrong, we sort of pinch them, or we send a paper across the table. And President Ramaphosa decided that he must meet all the leaders of the various groupings in South Sudan to persuade them that the practice of democracy and thus the implementation of the agreement on peace was an important undertaking that all of them should honor. Now, among the leaders, there are gradations of agreement. There are those who fully support implementing the agreement. There are those who, yeah, maybe, but then there are those against. So I watched President Ramaphosa with great interest on how he would engage those who are totally against. And I was quite intrigued by President Ramaphosa's negotiating capabilities. Wow, you know, because they kept saying all sorts of things, and he'd say, no, but you're not telling me what the real problem is. And then they'll speak and speak and speak. And he says, you still haven't told me. What is it that you are after? And in the end, they spill the beans. And he then helps to set in process the return to acceptance of a peaceful process. And I thought, my goodness, we are so lucky to have engaged leaders who can speak to others and persuade for peace. It's such an important attribute that our country has. Now, don't tell anyone I've told you that story, because I shouldn't. But we're also looking at how we might, as South Africa, strengthen the security architecture within the Southern African Development Community and, of course, in the African Union. Let me explain what I mean. You know that today we are seeing the bombardment of innocent Palestinian civilians who played no role in the Hamas attack of October 7th. Those innocent civilians have no protection whatsoever. It should be the responsible of the United Nations to ensure peace enforcement and protection of civilians. What the current calamity illustrates is that we don't have proper security architecture, which can, through leadership of AU or SADC or the United Nations, offer protection to ordinary civilians who have no role in a conflict and played no contribution in initiating it. So we believe that there needs to be very firm attention to the matter of security architecture within our region, at the continental level, and globally through the United Nations. We also believe that the United Nations should play a greater role in resourcing African Union-led peace operations, and also ensuring that there are high levels of gender mainstreaming and gender responsiveness when we have AU and UN peace missions. We support the boosting of international partnerships, including ensuring that we have long-standing partnerships on the continent that support the ambitions of the African Union. We associate ourselves very, very directly with the Secretary General of the United Nations' view that we should accelerate and scale up implementation of the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development Goals. He has said that a holistic approach to implementation of all three pillars of sustainable development is required, and we support him fully in this global agenda. We believe that as developing countries, we will only achieve sustainable development if we have a massive scale-up in provision of support from the richer countries of the world. We need the support in Africa, in the least developed countries on our continent and elsewhere, in landlocked countries, as well as in small island developing states. We know that domestic resources are insufficient for the key priorities within the Sustainable Development Goals. And it is important that we have support of finance, of technology transfer, and skills building in order to be able to address all the objectives of the SDGs. Before I'm stopped by the program director. I also want to say, one of the things that we need to do is that we must address the ending of the dependence of Africa. Africa is an extremely rich continent with a majority of poor people. Largely, the reason is we do not control our own resources. This inadequacy was clearly illustrated when we were confronted with the COVID-19 pandemic. We discovered in that crisis that the world is extremely selfish, and that where the rich have a solution, they will utilize the solution for themselves first and will think about us at the end. A further area in which I believe we can reduce our dependence as Africa is through implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, a very vital agreement and a flagship program of Agenda 2063 of the African Union. Currently, trade within our continent, or intra-African trade, is at around 16%. And we want to increase our share of world trade as Africa, which at the moment, in terms of products we send out, stands at around 3% of global export output. Totally inadequate figures. And we need to change this. In order to do so, we must achieve economic integration, we must achieve industrialization on the continent, we must secure infrastructure development to ensure that the logistics are in place to secure our ability to trade more effectively. We've got to increase productive capacity on the continent, have stronger regional value chains, manufacture more effectively quality products, and create economies of scale. So the work we've done of South Africa's automotive sector, also utilizing Lesotho for part of the components for the cars produced in South Africa, builds a very positive value chain that we need to really draw on for increasing Africa's participation in the world automotive sector. So I'm really thrilled that South Africa has taken the AFCFTA very seriously, and that we commenced trading in January last year, and that the majority of African states have now ratified the free trade agreement, which will vastly change Africa's landscape. Once implemented fully, the free trade area will connect 1.3 billion people with a combined GDP of around 3.3 billion US dollars. And all of us as entrepreneurs can benefit from that opportunity. As Africa, we have 650 million consumers today, and we will have a significant African middle class by 2030. So we really believe the AFCFTA has come at the right time, that this is Africa's time, and that the youth must take up all these opportunities and make good on them. So I say to young people that our international relations have been directed at enhancing diplomacy between South Africa and the rest of the African continent, but also strengthens our collaboration and development partnerships with countries of the North. As South Africa, we are not anyone's enemy. I always tell my foreign minister colleagues, we don't seek to make enemies of anyone. What we seek to create are opportunities for our country, our people, and for the continent. And where we see wrong, we will take a moral stand. So on the question of Palestine, we are clear. It is immoral what is happening to the Palestinian people. We will also take a stand on what is happening in Sudan, on what is happening in the Sahel, and several other African countries. South Africa must play a role equitably everywhere to ensure peace and development, and to utilize our achievement of democracy, to support the achievement of democracy and development in all parts of the world. So for us, when we talk international relations, we say a better South Africa, a better Africa, a better world. This is our commitment in international relations. Thank you very much.
Africa being a rich continent with the majority of poor people really needs these leaders, this type of leaders. These are the ones we need, leaders who dare to challenge the hypocrites of the Western countries. So thank you guys for watching this video.